Welcome to Freethought Matters. I'm Annie Laurie Gaylor.
And I'm Dan Barker. We're co-presidents of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. On today's show, we will introduce you to a world-famous ethicist and philosopher, Peter Singer, an atheist who believes in ethics without God.
The Freedom from Religion Foundation, which produces Freethought Matters, is the nation's largest association of free thinkers. That's atheists, agnostics, and other non-believers. We invite you to join us in our vital work to keep our secular government free from religious influence. Become a member at FFRF.org or ask for a complimentary copy of our newspaper, Freethought Today. Freedom depends on freethinkers. Watch prior episodes of Freethought Matters on FFRF's YouTube channel.
Welcome back to Freethought Matters. Our guest today, Peter Singer, is the DeCamp Professor of Bioethics at the University Center for Human Values at Princeton. He's the founding president of the International Association of Bioethics and founding co-editor of the journal Bioethics.
Peter Singer became internationally known with his best-selling book, Animal Liberation, in 1975, and more recently, Why Vegan? Eating Ethically. There are too many titles to list, but Professor Singer's other books include Practical Ethics, How Are We to Live?, Rethinking Life and Death, The President of Good and Evil, and A Darwinian Left, Politics, Evolution, and Cooperation. On the personal side, he has written Pushing Time Away, My Grandfather and the Tragedy of Jewish Vienna.
Peter Singer has written a number of books analyzing the concept and the efficacy of charity, such as The Most Good You Can Do and The Life You Can Save, which is also the title of his nonprofit organization. He specializes in ethics in the real world, which is the title of his 2016 book. In 2004, Peter Singer accepted FFRF's Emperor Has No Clothes Award. And if anyone fits the definition of being like the child in the Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale who fearlessly tells the emperor that he has no clothes, it is our guest today, Peter Singer.
So welcome, Professor Singer, and you're in Australia this semester, is that right?
That's right, yes. I'm on leave from Princeton, and it's currently summer here in Australia, so I'm enjoying that.
Yeah, enjoy for us. You're in Melbourne?
Yes, that's right.
So I remember when we met you back in 2004 and you received that Emperor Has No Clothes Award, a statue of a naked emperor, that you told us that when you informed your wife about that award, she asked you, does this mean you don't have to wear any clothes? You remember that?
Right. Yes, I do remember that, and I'm still wearing clothes, as you can see. It's probably more pleasant for your viewers. But I do have the statuette sitting back in Princeton on my filing cabinet in my office, and I was very honored to receive that award.
It's on the other side of the world then, isn't it?
Well, we're glad to hear that. Now, way back in 2004, when you gave an acceptance speech for the Emperor Has No Clothes Award, you told us then that no politician in Australia would ever end a speech with God bless you, or, that religion was not as integrated into the government, religious symbols and so on, as in the United States. Does that still hold true in Australia?
It still holds true in general. Yes, politicians don't end speeches saying God bless. We do have a prime minister who's religious, who's a member of a Pentecostalist church, but generally speaking, he's keeping it away from his politics. For example, he's not trying to introduce restrictive laws on abortion. I think he realizes that that would be electorally disastrous in Australia. He did recently try to introduce a bill allowing religious schools and other institutions to discriminate against people who were openly doing something contrary to their values. Obviously, that would include gays. And that bill actually has had trouble getting through Parliament because members of his own party crossed the floor and voted against it. And at the moment, they've now said they're not proceeding with it, or not in this Parliament. There's an election due in a few months, and maybe he's hoping to go back to it after the election. But yeah, at the moment, it's still illegal for religious institutions, for example, to say that they won't have gay people working for them.
Wow.
Well, that's good to hear.
So, maybe we should move down to Australia. So
you would have less work to do. You need to do the work where you are, unfortunately.
I guess they do need us here. And you're welcome to come back and help us, in our...
I will be coming back in the fall, and I'll certainly do my best to help.
Oh, very good.
Yeah.
So you're not... Were you raised religious, or have you been a lifetime non-religious, or why are you not religious?
No, I was not raised religious. My family, as indicated by that subtitle of the book that you mentioned, Pushing Time Away, my grandfather and the Tragedy of Jewish Vienna, my family was of religious background. In fact, my parents fled from Austria when the Nazis came to Austria and came out to Australia, but they were never religious themselves. They gave me the choice. When I turned 13, did I want to have a bar mitzvah? I said no, I didn't. I wasn't really a believer then either, and I didn't see the point of going through this ceremony. So, I've thought about God. I suppose there were years, in my teenage years particularly, when I wondered whether there could be some supernatural power, but fairly rapidly I thought, these are fairy tales that we tell ourselves to try to reassure us that the world is somehow run by a being who's looking after us, and after we die we'll go to some nice place. You can understand why people would like to believe that, but there just isn't the evidence for it.
So I think that your non-theistic point of view pretty much permeates your ethical points of view as well. I mean, you are looking head-on at many, many controversial issues like abortion rights, death with dignity, animal treatment, and so on. Do you connect the two?
I do, yes. I think that particularly on questions relating to death and dying, as you mentioned, it's religious views that have been the barrier to reducing the unnecessary suffering that occurs when somebody, for example, knows that they're going to die in weeks or months, who feel that their quality of life is poor, that their pain or their discomfort can't be fully relieved, or they're worried about their loss of autonomy and dependence on others, and they don't want to go on living. And there are physicians who are willing to help them, to assist them to die. And to have laws to prevent that happening doesn't do anyone any good, and clearly does harm. And it's overwhelmingly religious people who think that physicians should not be allowed to help people in those circumstances to die. So that's a clear case where I'm confronting religious views. But you're right. It's been true about abortion. That overwhelmingly the opposition comes from people who are religious, and even on the question of animals. It's the Christian church in particular has drawn this deep gulf between humans and animals. And historically, many major church figures from Augustine and Aquinas have said that we have no duties to animals, that we don't owe them anything really. And so it's more difficult, I think, to advance the cause of concern for animals in countries that are influenced by those traditions.
There's an irony in what you were talking about before. Everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die. You would think if they really believed in eternal life, they would welcome the end.
Yes, you would. That's absolutely right. And yet, of course, they fight against it as long as they can. So you wonder whether, they lack confidence. They say they believe in it, but really they're skeptical about whether there is anything beyond death. You're right that a lot of their actions are not consistent with the idea that they're confident that they're going to some better world, better life.
So you brought up the issue of abortion and how they're not trying to ban it right now in Australia, but of course, here in the United States, we're looking at this terrible SB 8 bill. In Texas, we're looking at the ban at 17 weeks that's before the U.S. Supreme Court. And all of this is this is a very huge ethical debate, and yet it seems to all be predicated on religion and ensoulment. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that and ethics in abortion.
Yes. I should say that, of course, there are people who are opposed to abortion who are not religious, but the great majority of the opposition does come from people who are religious. And if, in fact, this Supreme Court does uphold the Mississippi case that's before them and restricts abortion, it will be on the votes of Catholic justices that decision is taken, because the court does have a majority Catholic set of judges, and that's pretty concerning, I think, given that that's not the viewpoint of the majority of Americans. In terms of where they're arguing, there are different arguments. Certainly, some of them think that it's ensoulment that makes it wrong to kill, to end a human life, and although the church, in fact, was divided on when ensoulment takes place, and there are different opinions, that the standard view they're putting forward is that it takes place at conception, or that there's a possibility that it takes place at conception, and therefore you must not end the life of a human being from conception. So my view is rather different. I do accept one important point that opponents of abortion make, and that is, I accept that there is a living human being from conception. I don't think we should deny that. I think that's a biological fact. But what I question is whether the fact that you have a living human being means that that being has a right to life. And because of my views relating to animals, I don't think that just being a member of a certain species is enough to give you a right to life. I think you have to have certain characteristics, for example, at a minimum, consciousness, and most scientists don't think that the developing embryo or fetus is conscious until at the earliest 20 weeks, and a lot of them say it's probably more like 24 or even 26 weeks. So the vast majority of abortions would take place before there is any consciousness in the fetus. And arguably, for a right to life, you might need even more than that. You might need some kind of self-awareness, which probably doesn't happen until after birth. And I've been criticized for taking that view, for not drawing a sharp line at birth itself. But I do think that it's the idea that somehow just being a human, just being a member of that particular species, gives you a right to life that we should be criticizing. And I think that, again, if we dropped a religious perspective, we wouldn't think that. It's part of this idea, again, that humans are made in the image of God, that God has this special concern for members of our species that God doesn't have for members of other species. I think that's what gives many Christians the idea that there's something sacrosanct.
Go out and have dominion. To quote Genesis.
Exactly, yes. The dominion verse is also there too, that humans are given dominion over other animals. And so that's the idea that even when you just have a couple of cells, a zygote with no nervous system, no brain, no awareness, anything like that, that is still something precious and sacrosanct that cannot be sacrificed. For example, in the case of research on embryos, and some people really, if they're consistent about that, they ought to be opposed to the use of IUDs as contraceptives, because they prevent the early zygote from implanting. But
and of course, some of them are, unfortunately.
So we have to take a break here, Professor Singer. So, and after the break, we want to hear some of your comments and some of your advice on the life you can save and the most good you can do. And I want to ask you how you can be an ethicist if you don't have a God. We'll be right back with more Freethought Matters.
Hi, I'm Ron Reagan, an unabashed atheist.
When I first recorded that commercial back in 2014, being openly atheist in America was still fairly uncommon. Today, the fastest growing religious group in the country is the non-religious, especially among the young. That progress is heartening, but the religious pushback is fierce and the forces of Christian nationalism are well organized. Our progress won't continue unless we work together so that reason and our secular constitution will prevail. That's why I'm asking you to join the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest and most effective association of atheists and agnostics working to keep state and church separate, just like our founders intended. Please join the Freedom from Religion Foundation today. Ron Reagan, lifelong atheist, not afraid of burning in hell.
Welcome back to Freethought Matters. We're talking with the eminent ethicist and author, Peter Singer, about ethics without God, and we want to get into some of the nitty-gritty now. Let's talk about the life you can save and the most good you can do. You founded a group called The Life You Can Save, and you've raised millions of dollars for effective charities. So, to state the obvious, why should we care, and what is effective altruism?
Well, we should care because it's easy for us to do good for people in extreme poverty at very little sacrifice. I've compared it with saving a child who's drowning in a shallow pond, where the only cost is that you'll ruin your expensive shoes that you're wearing, but you're going to save a child's life. And I think everybody would say that's the right thing to do. You'd be a monster if you said, no, I don't want to ruin my shoes, so I'm going to let this child drown. But in fact, every day there are children dying in low-income countries from preventable poverty-related causes. UNICEF says about 5 million a year, so something like 13,000 a day. And by giving to the most effective charities, we can save those lives. We can provide bed nets to protect them against malaria. We can provide sanitation so they don't get diarrhea. We can do a whole lot of things to save and to improve their lives as well. But we need to know which are the most effective charities. And if you go to thelifeyoucansave.org, you'll find about 20 recommended charities that have been independently assessed as being highly effective. And they're the ones that I'm encouraging people to donate to. And as you say, currently the figure is about $65 million that we've been able to track going through that website to effective charities. So I'm really happy that we've been able to have that impact. But of course, there's lots more. I'd like a lot more people to go there.
Can you save a life for the price of a pair of shoes?
Well, it would have to be a really expensive pair of shoes now. We have done the figures a bit more carefully. You are looking at something in the low thousands, 2,000, 3,000, maybe to save a life through distributing bed nets, because you have to distribute quite a lot of bed nets to make sure you're saving a life. But, as a free bonus for what you're donating, you're preventing many more serious cases of malaria, which is a pretty nasty disease. I had it a long time ago, and it's not pleasant. So you've got that extra thing that you're doing for maybe $3,000. And there are many other things like restoring sight in people who are blind, which you can do for just a few $100s. We recommend charities that are doing that as well. Repairing fistulas, which are injuries that occur in childbirth for young women who are not very well developed, particularly in low-income countries, and it renders them incontinent if they can't get it repaired, and they often get thrown out of their families because they're too hard to keep clean. So you can give a young woman her life back for probably just under $1,000.
At the thelifeyoucansave.org, is that right?
That's correct. That's right.
Wow.
So you do have a way to gauge or rate what is an effective charity and what isn't. So could you let us in on that?
Because we always get these requests through email or through mail. We don't know how to tell from this paper we're reading.
Right. It takes a lot of research, and we don't do all that research ourselves. We draw on other bodies that do. GiveWell is one of the foremost researchers. They have been assessing charities, and they have very rigorous standards, so we draw on them. But we also draw from others who research we consider to be reliable to broaden the field a little bit. it's a matter of looking at what they're actually doing, not just looking at how much they're spending on administration, which, can be relevant, but doesn't really tell you. They could spend little on administration, but have no staff to supervise that what they're doing is actually working. So you need to look at what those interventions are. You need to have independent studies to show that they're working, to show that they make a difference. And then you can support the charities that are cost effectively providing those interventions.
So is the general idea the greatest good for the greatest number?
Yes, I think so. Of course, that greatest number has led some people to say, well, would you do something horrible to a minority if 51% of the population wanted it? That's not my view, because you have to consider not just numbers, but how important is this for people? And, again, it's not terribly important to most of us if we have another $1,000 or not over a year, because that's a relatively small amount of what we spend and it wouldn't have a huge impact on our life. But for people in extreme poverty who are living on about $2 a day, so less than $1,000 a year, that can change their lives. To give them that amount that they have more than an annual income, now they can do things that they could never have dreamt of doing. Maybe they can start a small business. Maybe they can put a good roof on their house that won't leak and won't ruin their food stores. Maybe they can send their children to school. Maybe, as I said, they can restore their sight. Yes, we can do a great deal of good at very low cost to ourselves. And that's why I think we ought to do it. It's as straightforward as that.
Well, it's a wonderful charity, or maybe charity isn't the right word, but a wonderful charity that you have founded. I do want to change the topic and ask about the ethics, or how you feel about the COVID pandemic and how resources have been allocated, and the ethics of people who refuse to be vaccinated to protect society.
Well, a couple of things. Firstly, just following on from what I was saying, the vaccines have not been allocated in the way that they should. We are getting far more vaccines, obviously, in wealthy nations, and people in low-income countries have very low rates of vaccination, not because they're refusing, but because the supply isn't there. And, we are one world. This is a global pandemic, and we really need to try to deal with it everywhere. But on some of the other ethical issues about the pandemic and the way we have dealt with it, and particularly people who are refusing to get vaccinated, I think that this is not actually a personal choice. You could argue, for example, that whether you wear a seatbelt when you're in a car is a personal choice, because if you don't, you're the one who's going to get killed or injured. But if you don't get vaccinated, you are more likely to spread the virus to others. And also, we've seen this seriously now, you are more likely to take up scarce medical resources. So the New York Times had an opinion piece a while ago from a guest columnist who's an emergency physician in a regional part of Michigan where relatively few people are vaccinated. And he said that 98% of the critical care patients in his hospital are unvaccinated people with COVID. And that means that other people who need surgery, maybe nothing to do with COVID. There was a case of a man who had sepsis who couldn't get moved to a hospital that could do the surgery he needed because they were all full with unvaccinated patients with COVID. And sadly, he died. And his family said, these people who didn't get vaccinated are responsible for the death of our father.
Terrible way to die, too.
Terrible way to die, yeah. And you are having an effect on other people. It's not just your own choice.
Now, we only have about 2 minutes left, so this isn't very fair, but we haven't talked about the ethics of animals, how we treat animals, eating them, and so on. And I know that's one of your passions.
It is, yes. And again, I think that if we see ourselves as a being who has evolved from other animals on this planet with no God-given right to dominion over them, then we can't ignore inflicting suffering on them. We can't say, well, they're just animals, it doesn't matter. And in fact, we are inflicting a vast amount of suffering on non-human animals, particularly in the factory farm systems that we've set up, because the numbers of animals in those systems are so vast. Something like 70 billion animals are reared and killed for food each year worldwide, and the vast majority of them in factory farms. So that's 70 billion is more, almost 10 times the human population, and we're giving them miserable lives, overcrowded, not suited to their social needs, and often there's rampant cruelty taking place because lowly paid workers who are frustrated and take things out on the animals, unfortunately. And this is a disaster in environmental terms. It's not an effective way of feeding ourselves because we're wasting a lot of the food that we're putting into these animals, and it increases the risks of pandemics. So to me, the priority is to stop factory farming. And I'd really ask everybody who's looking at this to say, think about what you're purchasing. Are you contributing to a system that is bad for animals, bad for the planet, and not an effective way of feeding people?
I've talked to a number of people who said your book, Animal Liberation, is what prompted them to become vegetarians.
I'm glad to hear that. But we need to have a lot more people who are not buying these factory farm products and preferably being vegetarian or even vegan. And I think that movement is growing, and I hope it will continue to grow as we get more plant-based foods out in the supermarkets. But we still do have a long way to go.
Well, a last parting word on ethics from you?
Yeah, so let me just say, I don't think that you need belief in God for ethics. I think it has nothing to do with it. I think ethics can come from our capacities to reason and capacity to see that we are ourselves beings capable of suffering. We don't want to suffer. And we see other beings also capable of suffering who try to avoid suffering whenever they can. And whether they are humans or non-humans, I think we ought to have equal concern for interests. Pain is pain, however, whoever experiences it, whether it's you or me, whether it's a person on the other side of the world, whether it's a pig in a factory farm, we should be trying to reduce that pain and suffering as much as we can.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Professor Singer.
Thank you, Annie and Dan. It's been great to talk to you again.
And thank you for watching Freethought Matters.
Because free thought matters.
Hi, I'm Steve Pinker. In my book, Enlightenment Now, I show that the world has become a better place as reason has been overcoming superstition and tribalism. But the values of the Enlightenment are under attack. That's why I'm a proud member of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest association of free thinkers working to keep state and church separate. Please join me in supporting the Freedom from Religion Foundation to ensure that our government is driven not by religion, but by reason.